In our last lesson, we talked at great length about the territorial configuration and reconfigurations that were happening in India subsequent to India attaining its independence in 1947. The Britishers had completely ravaged the country, so to speak, because they had drained all the wealth and resources that the country boasted of. They took away raw materials from the country to produce finished goods in England, which in turn filled the Indian markets. For this, the indigenous markets and the goods which were produced in India suffered heavily. At the same time, the Britishers also produced those cash crops which were in demand in England. And so there used to be acute food shortages. Coupled with that, the Britishers also used to grow food crops to feed the British Indian Army. So the masses had nothing left for them, so to speak. At this point of time when India gained its independence, it now had the great responsibility of recuperating Indian economy. Because the country in its initial stages had to begin from the scratch. It had to begin from an absolute zero. In this lesson, we will be focusing on the planning for development that was happening in post-independence India. We will be talking about the various developmental projects that helped to boost Indian economy. The top politicians of the country at this point of time had two very basic objectives to boost and help the growth of Indian economy. And these two objectives would be that India and the Indians had to be lifted out of poverty. Because if the Indians and the country as a whole remained enmeshed in poverty, then growth and development for the country would be halted. And so it was very important to lift India and Indians out of poverty. At the same time, another objective that needed to be fulfilled to boost Indian economy was to build a modern technical and industrial base. Because till this point of time, there were not many huge industries which could contribute to the country's economy. So a proper technical and industrial base was a prerequisite to boost the country's production and in turn the country's economy. During this time, the politicians were thinking of various reforms and policies that could be brought into being. But these could not be done very haphazardly. There had to be a centralized system which would take care of these reform policies to help the Indian economy. And to this end, in 1950, a planning commission was set up. And this planning commission was to aid in formulating and executing suitable policies for economic development. Because without economic development, India was going nowhere, and this is something that the politicians had understood. And so they had to do something in order to bring about changes and reforms in the economic structure of the country. And so this planning commission sought to do the same. Let us now learn about certain ideas that the planning commission put forward. The planning commission suggested a mixed economic model for economic development in the country. But what do we understand by this mixed economy model? For this, we will have to take into account the global politics at this point of time. The Second World War had come to an end in 1945. Since the early years of the 1950s, now emerged two great political powers who divided the world, so to speak. And these two great political powers were the USA and the USSR. The USA and the USSR were divided on terms of their ideologies. The USA is a liberal democratic nation, and it is in support of private enterprises. On the other hand, the erstwhile USSR was a communist state, and it sought to abolish private ownership of property in support of public ownership of the means of production. So we can understand that USA is a capitalist country, and on the other hand, the erstwhile USSR was a socialist nation. And in this way, these two powers had divided the world. Now, the Indian economy was in a very bad shape at this point of time, and the politicians knew that they had to do something to pull India out of darkness, to pull India out of a state of economic crisis. And to this end, a mixed economy model was suggested for development in the country. By this mixed economy model, it meant that both the state as well as the private sector would now undertake a very important role in increasing production and generating jobs. Now, these two things were the most crucial things that would now contribute to the country's economy. Because if the production units were now strengthened, then the country would be able to produce its own goods. And this in turn will also help the markets. This in turn will also facilitate trade activities, be that within the nation or with other foreign nations. At the same time, the masses also required to be employed, which is why there was a need for generating jobs for the masses. So this mixed economy model was actually an in-between path. Both the state and the private sectors would join hands to boost the production units as well as generate employment opportunities for the Indian masses. The Planning Commission then came up with another new kind of policy or program, and this was known as the 5 years planning model. The 5 years planning model was adopted by India. Do you know what this 5 years planning model means? This refers to that the 5-year plans would be centralized and integrated national economic programs. So these 5-year plans would be taken care of by the state as a whole, and this would be centralized and integrated economic programs. And these 5-year plans were to be developed, executed and monitored by the Planning Commission. Now, when we talk about the 5-year plans that were implemented in India, we should definitely mention how the country was inspired by the USSR. In the USSR following the Russian Revolution, 5-year plans were implemented by the Communist Party from 1928. And these 5-year plans helped USSR to a very great extent, because these boosted the production units, heavy industrialization happened in the country, and as a result of these successful 5-year plans, USSR emerged as a world power to compete even with the USA post Second World War. And India, as you know, is a sovereign socialist secular democratic republic. There is a mention of the word socialist. The first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, was very inspired by the socialist model, the 5-year plans that were implemented in USSR and that helped USSR gain power in world politics. And to this end, these 5-year plans were now being implemented in India as well. The first 5-year plan was implemented in India in 1951. These 5-year plans were devised for a period of 5 years, as you can understand. And these 5-year plans had very new objectives. So the first 5-year plan had its own objective and it began in 1951. After it was successful, the next or the second 5-year plan was implemented from 1956. That also had its own set of objectives to take care of. And in this way, India has been having many 5-year plans till the year 2017. From 2012 to 2017 functioned the last and the 12th 5-year plan in India. And in 2017, under the leadership of the present Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi, this planning commission was replaced by Niti Aayog. So having introduced ourselves to this concept of 5-year plan, let us now briefly discuss one such 5-year plan which was very successful. But before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. When was the first 5-year plan implemented in India? Was it implemented in 1950, 1951, 1956 or in 1961? Well, the correct answer is 1951. The first 5-year plan was implemented in 1951 and it was to be executed under the Planning Commission. So let us now briefly discuss the second 5-year plan that took place between 1956 and 1961. So just a while ago we mentioned that these 5-year plans had their own strategies and their own objectives. The second 5-year plan focused on the development of the public sector as well as rapid industrialization. Because at this point of time, India did not have many industries, many factories which could produce different goods. And so, the second 5-year plan now sought to bring about rapid industrialization in the country. Because with boosting industrialization, different kinds of goods could now be produced in the country itself. When the second 5-year plan was implemented and during this period of rapid industrialization, steel was given great importance. Many steel plants came up in different parts of the country and these steel plants were helped by the USSR, Germany or even Britain. And needless to mention, these steel plants played a very important role in different ways. Firstly, many kinds of goods were being produced in these factories. At the same time, a whole host of individuals got employment in these factories. So these steel plants also produced employment opportunities for the Indian masses. These steel plants or the big industries and factories also helped the growth of small factories. Why is it so? Because in order to make any industry or huge factory function, different kinds of goods are required. Allow me to give you an example here. If a steel plant is set up somewhere, different kinds of tools will be required to make the machines function. And so a separate factory would now spring up where those tools could be produced. So in this way, the setting up of one factory necessitates that many new factories will come into being. And in this way, this rapid industrialization which was happening under the second 5-year plan now helped in bringing to being many new factories and industries in several parts of the country. The construction of dams was also boosted because of this. This is because water was required for the functioning of these factories. And in order to get more and more water, dams were put in place. So you can understand from this how this worked as a series of events in a cyclical manner. One was linked to the other. And this is how the various 5-year plans were working. This second 5-year plan was supposed to have a trickling down effect. How is it so? Because when more labor was required to run those huge factories and industries, we learned that small factories were also coming to being. And so in these small factories as well, many people were employed. At the same time, there was the requirement for the transportation of finished goods from these industries. And so people were also being employed in the transport system. So various kinds of opportunities were now being created for the Indian masses. And this is how the trickling down effect was supposed to happen. One big industry was to have its influence in an entire region by setting up many new factories, by creating new opportunities for the masses, by creating new settlements as a whole. The Bhilai steel plant was set up in 1959 with help from the USSR, and this was set up in a rural area in Chhattisgarh. And when such a huge steel plant was set up in a rural region, the masses were able to see how changes were happening with regard to industrial developments in the country. And this also provided employment to the people who lived in that rural region. So the masses were now able to understand how changes and developments were happening in the independent modern India. But the 5-year plans have also been criticized on several grounds. Let us now look at some of the criticisms that have been rallied against the second 5-year plan. Firstly, it has been criticized for its inadequate emphasis on agriculture. India has been an agricultural country for several centuries. In fact, agriculture still plays a very important role in India's economy even today. Now, many sections of the population were of the opinion that simply by boosting industrial production, agriculture was not taken care of. And if agriculture is not taken care of, then there might be food shortages, there might be different kinds of issues that the population would now be faced with. And so this was one criticism that came up against the second 5-year plan. Next, we have another criticism, which was that the second 5-year plan did not really take into consideration primary education. Now, the neglect of primary education was another idea that was put forward by many critics of the second 5-year plan. Why is it so? These people were of the opinion that by simply boosting industrial production, the masses were still uneducated and illiterate. So the masses had to be educated, and this work had to begin from the foundation itself. By introducing primary education and then higher education, the masses would now be equipped with the knowledge of pursuing separate professions. So along with boosting industrial production, these people were now of the opinion that the state should now also take care of primary education. And last but not the least, many environmentalists mentioned that the second 5-year plan did not take into account the environmental implications of the economic policies. Because if any industry or factory is set up somewhere, it takes a toll on the environment of that region. Harmful and poisonous gases as well as wastes are released from these factories. And in order to have a healthy planet, it is very important to take into account the environmental implications of these economic policies that were instituted by the 5-year plans. Meera Behan was a very staunch follower of Mahatma Gandhi. In 1949, Meera Behan wrote that by science and machinery, he, which refers to humankind, may get huge returns for a time, but ultimately will come dissolution. We have got to study nature's balance and develop our lives within her laws if we are to survive as a physically healthy and morally decent species. So we need to take into account the environment, the nature, and we have to adjust our policies in such a way that those suit the nature, so that we don't actually ravage the nature that would sustain us in the longer run. This now brings us to an end of our discussion on the planning for development in post-independence India. In this lesson, we learnt about the objectives that India had to take care of at this point of time in order to boost economic development. So the masses had to be lifted out of a state of poverty and economic crisis. At the same time, there was the need for building a proper and modern technical and industrial base. Now in 1950, the Planning Commission was constituted and it played a very important role in bringing into being several 5-year plans. Many 5-year plans came into being. Many were successful, while some were not. It is not to say that all these 5-year plans were successful in bringing about their desired objectives, but it is also not to say that these 5-year plans ended up in failure. Many of these 5-year plans had their inherent flaws, which is why these could not emerge successful. But over the years, Indian economy has grown and developed. We are not where we began in the 1950s. Indian economy is now important in world politics as well. Having talked about India's economic policy in this lesson, in our subsequent lesson we will be focusing on India's foreign policy. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million+ questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.